organization, your institution, whatever space, to really think about the reason and context for doing that. I began that journey personally around self-discovery. So if you do have your cell phone, you can scan this QR code and it'll actually take you to a map. Because I do believe a part of the first step is discovering the land that you are currently on, right? Because we do know, based upon our history, that people were here before the European settlers arrived. And so what's really cool about this particular app, you're able to literally put in your location. I encourage you to do it for your home address, for your work address, and it gives you a sense of the history of the cultures of the peoples, the first peoples who inhabited that land. So this is a resource I like to share with folks. Again, this is in your workbook, so feel free to do this at a later time if you choose to. Okay. As we get started, I have a tradition. This is something we'll do at the top of every session. I like to take a moment to really center us into why we're here today. What has happened as a result of the pandemic? We have moved virtually for everything, which means some of you may have literally just come from something that ended at 11:59 before showing up here for 12, right? And you might have something at 1:31 as soon as we get done, okay? Things have really changed and shifted. And as a result, sometimes we walk into these virtual spaces and it's easy to be distracted. So I really want to take a moment to center us for the time that we're together, to have our attention really be on what we're doing here today, so that the hope is once we leave from here, we can take some nuggets from today into the future. So the way this activity works, very simply, if you have your workbook, it's already there. If not, just grab a piece of paper and you're going to put 4 quadrants, okay, on your piece of paper, okay? And what I'm going to have you do, the first thing we're going to do is just ground ourselves. And it's a simple activity. I'm going to set a timer for just 45 seconds. And you're going to draw a spiral right here in the center, the tightest spiral you can, okay? And I'll tell you when to do that. And then I'm going to ask you 4 questions. You're going to put your responses in each of these boxes, okay? Just to give us a moment to do that. So I'm going to set the first timer. Again, it's just 45 seconds. And you will draw the tightest little spiral right there where those 2 lines cross. Be sure you're breathing as you do this. You might be surprised that you were holding your breath. Okay, and so for the first question in the top left corner, when you think of health equity, what comes to mind? The first question, when you think of health equity, what comes to mind? All right, our second question in the top right corner, what fears do you have about prioritizing equity? What fears do you have about prioritizing equity? Okay, our next question in the bottom left corner. What do you think is our biggest potential for change? What do you think is our biggest potential for change? And then our final question, what are you hoping to get from today's workshop? Think about why you decided to come today and just jot that down. Okay. All right, so thank you all for doing that activity. I appreciate your participation. I have three primary objectives for our time together. I want to have a bit of a conversation around how our environments cultivate health and wellness. I want to walk through the foundational terminology, make sure we all have the same shared language for what we mean. And then I want to end by having a bit of reflection on how do we take the content today and use it in our everyday work, in what we're doing. Like I said, feel free to stop me. Let's really talk and have conversation. If there's anything I mentioned that is unclear, there are no wrong questions at all. This really, truly is the safest space to ask all the questions and kind of think about different things. So this is something that I think about a lot, is how our environments cultivate our health. My background is in sociology, and the reason I chose sociology over psychology is because I felt as if sociology really helped me think about people, communities, how we learn from the people around us to do, to behave, to exist in the world. And so there's this graphic that I came across that I really want to kind of break down for us and think about as a group, which is that our environments cultivate our communities and our communities nurture our health. And I want for you to take a minute to think about for yourself your actual environment. As you visualize where you live, the neighborhood, what you have access to, whether that's parks or schools or libraries, the grocery stores. Are your sidewalks safe? You know, could you go for a run or a walk? And as you truly think about the community in which you live, in what ways is that space nurturing your health, your well-being? And to me, this is truly the scope of public health practice, okay, and prevention practice. And so this graphic has two ideas: that sometimes there are communities to which the inequities are high and the assets are low. And as a result of that particular space and environment, a community may suffer greater from things like heart disease, malnutrition, okay? Some of the symptoms that we have a tendency to look at when we collect data, okay? That's what the top of the tree is, where the leaves are missing. The trunk of the tree is really looking at what are some of the systemic things that may be happening, whether that is restricted power or a community that doesn't have really great investments into it, right? Because in order for a community to be prosperous, it's got to have money and income, right? And then in the root system below, this is looking at the bigger environmental structural things that may be happening. So maybe a community is experiencing joblessness, unemployment, maybe there's racism in a particular community. We even got things like marketing, which any of you who study things like alcohol, tobacco marketing that may happen in one community versus another, especially by income, you'll see differences there. And so what happens is the ideas in public health often, we have a tendency to focus our strategies at the top of the tree. We want to work on reducing violence, reducing heart disease, reducing depression, reducing substance misuse, which are great. In order to do that, we've got to start looking a little bit deeper down the tree into the roots that's creating the disparity issues. And that's really the essence of this graphic. Whereas the other side shows what happens when a community has high assets and low inequities. And visually, you already see the tree is blossoming, right? It's a bigger tree. What is very curious, though, when you look at the two trees side by side, the exact same illnesses, diseases exist on both sides. So the point of this graphic is not to say that a community with high assets won't have disease and illness, because that is a part of the human condition. The tree is to say that when we actually really look at the root system and really help the environment be healthy, we can create resilience and thriving in communities, which is so important. So for me, I like to kind of start here and to really think about, for the communities that we're serving, what type of environments are you seeing? If you were to map your community, how many of the trees would look like the one on the left? And how many trees would look like the one on the right? Okay. And really, this just helps us kind of think about that context in which we're doing our work, which is so important for understanding why disparities or inequities happen. Another topic here for me that I want to share, and then I'd like for us to have a bit of a discussion about this and how you're seeing it in your community, is ACEs specifically, because to me, these things are very much so connected here. Many of you heard of ACEs. For a while, we were talking about the pair of ACEs. The one that I like that is out there is called the Three Realms of ACEs. So I share that with you all today. And it's looking a little bit deeper than level one. I think the original ACEs study, which came out in the 90s, got a little bit of flack because it was mainly focused on this one domain, right? You could take the assessment of the 10 things and you would know what your ACE score is. So that's an important concept, right? What's happening on the individual level? A lot of research has gone into this to expand it beyond just what's happening in the household domain space, to consider that there are adverse community environments too, right? Where if you really look at the root system of what's happening, these are communities where the air is poor quality, there's poverty, standard living is not the best, and that these are things that impact the domain one, right? Naturally so, okay? In addition, I think the thing that I saw that I really appreciated here most recently is the expansion of the third domain, which is our environments. They've even added the pandemic on here most recently when they redid this graphic, to consider the ways in which even the environment impacts health and wellness and adverse traumatic experiences for people. I'm sure you all have seen it in your communities, and it's been something we've been dealing with now for a few years, even residually, what has been happening with the pandemic. But also not just the pandemic, you all, we've been hearing about natural disasters. Those are things that create all sorts of stress and trauma, which place people at risk for multiple things. And so what I want to do here, we were going to do it as a breakout room discussion, but I'm going to stop sharing so I can see folks. I'd love to just maybe talk a little bit about even these concepts of the environment, health and wellness. Is anything resonating for you? Are you seeing some connections with this content with the communities you're serving? And so whoever wants to talk, feel free, you can unmute yourself.
I think in the schools, we're certainly seeing an uptick of anxiety, mental health concerns, and then also somatic complaints around, times where there's more sort of news on around the pandemic or the triple demic or whatever they're calling it now. And then also, kids with families that have, are in flood zones in California or in Florida when the hurricane is coming. I think all of that impacts them in a very real way that I feel like we're seeing more in the last few years than we saw 10 years ago. So I'm glad to see that in the ACEs.
I was too, because it's a relevant point, right? And you all, when we think about coping strategies, right? What people do to deal with trauma and stress, often it's substance use, it's vaping, it's alcohol, it's marijuana, it's all the things that we care about, especially our youth, from not doing, you know what I mean, when they're below a particular age. So the work is truly connected. Any other thoughts or comments from folks on this? Yeah.
The first domain is interesting in context with the Needham community where I work and live. And my experience from a community perspective as a parent of 3 who are now young adults, but is that a lot of the qualifiers listed here for the household are fraught with certain degrees of stigma, and that there are, I suspect that there is a fair amount of stigma around some of these things, whether it's domestic violence, emotional abuse, substance use within the home, mental illness within the home. I can't speak for all of them, but I'm going to suspect strongly that impacts, for example, how we reach certain populations in the work that we do around substance use prevention for our youth, because parents don't necessarily, I don't mean to target parents as an only audience here, but centering that just for a minute, I think that parents have a hard time coming to terms with their own behaviors. And I think that there's a lot of shame and guilt and stigma, as I said, around some of these that are presented here. It's more the unspoken thing, and it's harder to put our hands on it, but I think it comes into play with the work that we're doing. Absolutely.
I couldn't agree with you more, right? So it's like we add yet another layer, which is stigma. Stigma keeps folks from even disclosing some of those things in the household space, right? And then because there is public stigma and social stigma around these things, sometimes our environments are not the most conducive to people feeling they can disclose too, right? So it definitely goes both ways. And I appreciate you mentioning that and kind of highlighting that specific to this topic, right? Any other thoughts or reflections about this for folks? Ways in which this is showing up in the communities you serve and the work you're doing? Yeah.
I just want to say I really have a lot of respect and value for ACEs, and I haven't seen it laid out like this. In our work, we look at the risk and protective factors in the individual, selective, and community level, right? And we try to, with data and analysis, look at strategies that can target the risk factors, build up the protective factors. But I really appreciate that with this 3 realms, it now validates, we have to be mindful of the environment and the impact those events and happenings have. So I guess it just says to me, it supports our collaboration with different partners in our communities. Like, I appreciate Melissa being here, public health director, Susanna, the head of school health. I mean, it just validates to me that the work is deep and broad, but we all have a role to play.
Exactly. I agree. I agree. Any other thoughts folks want to share here? Had anyone else seen the three realms of ACEs in this way? Okay, yeah, great. That's why I share it. I came across it. I was like, I love this. The sociologist in me was like, yes, beyond just the household, because all those other things really do matter and create trauma, right, for folks. So awesome. Okay. Great. So I'll go back here to the screen share to share just another thought here, another graphic. This comes from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which I've heard they've actually even redone this one. So I got to look at the newest version too. But I like this for just understanding the language when we say equality versus equity and what we mean. And this just looks at why we've made that language change. Because sometimes when we're looking at the tree and looking at inequities and all this sort of thing and looking at strategies, sometimes our approach is to, equally serve. And unfortunately, equality isn't enough, really. And so what this graphic shows is that when we focus on equality, which is saying, I've created a resource that's going to help and assist a community, and I'm going to give that resource to everybody. The challenge with that approach is that it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the diversity of people that are in a particular community. And so if you look at this, right, mathematically, there's really only a fourth of these folks in this top one who really, that bike is like perfect for that person. Everyone else, you're kind of missing. And so when you look at it from the mathematical perspective in that way, it's like, wow, we don't really think about how equality really doesn't help meet the particular need. Whereas equity looks at what is the diversity of the community that I'm working with, and how can I create a resource that really is inclusive to those diverse needs. And in this instance, right, I think what's challenging about equity is it requires more resources, because I went from building one bike that I gave to everybody to now having to actually create 4 different types of resources, right? So I think some of the challenge with equity is until we also have honesty about the fact that equity does require a different set of resources, more time, more energy, we can't really prepare, honestly, to actually put equity into action and to actually do equity in the communities we serve. Just consider, in order for me to have developed the 4 bikes, I have to actually know about my community. I have to know there's some folks who would benefit from the tricycle. I have to know there's some folks who need it short or need it tall, right? That requires actually doing a community needs assessment in order for that to happen, so that you can create and construct the response that is actually equitable. So it requires us to slow down a little bit, not move immediately into implementation in order to really meet the needs of diverse populations. So I just like to share this graphic because I know for me, I've seen multiples. There's the fence, right, with the people at the fence and the boxes. There's a lot of different versions. And for me, this one does a really good job of articulating some of the other things we have to consider when we say we're focusing on equity. Okay. Any questions about this graphic? Okay. Awesome. Okay. So for the second objective, I want to spend just a little bit of time looking and talking about our foundational terminology, language stuff, because I've learned this is really, really important to making sure we all understand what's actually happening when we look at data. Data is such a critical component of our work. We're going to really dive into data in a future session. And this begins to kind of dabble into it a bit by looking at our definitions. So a common word that's used is health disparity. It is used a lot. I've heard it a lot. And I think, honestly, it wasn't until I got older that I really understood what a true disparity is. And the main thing I like to help people remember is that a disparity is a preventable difference in health outcomes. That's the best way to really think about it, with the focus on the word preventable. Okay. And I feel like in all the years I learned about diversity, the preventable part was never really focused on. It was like disparities are differences in health outcomes. But this preventable part is everything, because the reasons it's preventable is that the difference is not based on biology. It's based on socially constructed things like race, like people's income, sexual orientation, gender, ability status, geographic location. And when you really look at disparities, we should be saying, why is it that this is happening? Because there isn't a reason that it should. There is something happening socially that's creating the difference in health outcomes. And I think sometimes that is the challenging part for us to kind of recognize. I think, if anything, disparities show our isms, whether that's sexism, racism, ability statusism, all the various isms, right? Ageism, these sort of things. Our disparities really spotlight where those things are. And I know for me, it's been really an interesting learning journey along the way to truly understand that. I always like to share data. Data helps me understand concepts. So I pulled a data point for Massachusetts that specifically looks at HIV diagnosis, only because I think this one is one of the ones that historically has disparities embedded in it, that can be really striking when you kind of think about this. So I'm just showing them here in kind of like a slow reveal status of seeing from your 2020 data, and I got this from the Kaiser Family Foundation, of what the distribution of data is looking like for what percentage of the population the group makes up versus the burden of disease on the HIV diagnosis space. Okay. And what's interesting, you all, I don't know about for you, but when I see these number differences, it's extremely striking. And the reason this is a disparity is because the difference in health outcome is preventable. That's the key to remember here. And so when I did the quick math, I'm like, wow, in the state, BIPOC folks make up 30% of the population, yet 67% of the HIV diagnosis. Why? Right? In my younger days, I wouldn't focus too much on this and just be like, wow, people of color are more likely to get HIV. That's just how it was told to me, but not thinking about the social and structural things that are making that possible. So what I encourage us to do as we look at our data, to really be looking at the disparity data in a way that's helping us identify, why is it that some communities are experiencing a greater burden than another? You can do this with your overdose data too, right? Are there any differences about the demographics? I know many places are seeing a trend difference where we are seeing more BIPOC folks who are experiencing overdose. And so really just kind of thinking about that as you look at your data and discover what a disparity is. I want to pause just a minute here on the word disparity and just check and see, does anyone have any questions about what a disparity is? Or did any of this resonate for you specifically in thinking about disparities in your community? And I'll stop so I can see you guys real quick. Yes,
I'm the same as you. When I had heard disparities, I didn't put prevention with that
right.
at all.
Mm-hmm.
A disparity for me was health differences,
Mm-hmm.
and that it ended there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really nice for you to highlight that for me, because although I think I know now as an older person, when I first heard it was maybe 20 years ago. And maybe I've kind of made up my own mind about it, but to see it defined this way, I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've personally had to do this because, I went to grad school. I have an MPH. So like disparities is what we talk about in public health. Yet that preventable part is so important. And for me, it just became characterizations of a group of people, which is very different. And I think it's a part of the reason why we still believe races exist as people, because there's this, we've seen a lot of data that's divvied out by race without looking at the disparity part and understanding that disparities are preventable. So it's a challenge. I think there's some things we kind of have to unlearn for how some things have been taught to us. So thank you for sharing that, for sure. Any other thoughts or reflections on this one? Because I know for me, this has been a big one, is really unearthing that piece there of what an actual disparity is.
I think it's helpful to hear this multiple times. Did you speak to the school nurse group through DPH, the nurse leaders?
I don't know.
Did this
I
group
don't-
speak?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was not very long ago, like
Okay.
2 or 3 months ago.
Mm.
And I feel like it was the same information. I feel like it was Rise, this group that your group spoke. And it was just really interesting to now hear it again, because I sort of fought against it, and we went into breakout rooms and it was sort of like, but the data is saying, and like I'd always felt like, the health disparities were sort of organized in this, there's higher risk of different conditions for different groups of people. And then to really break it down, like we make that happen.
We do.
And so I really appreciate the opportunity to hear it again, because I tried to understand it and be there with it the first time, and I wasn't. So thank you.
Listen, thank you for sharing that, because that is a perspective that not many people are willing to actually admit. Because it does take a bit of unlearning. Like, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean it's preventable? Because you're right. Like, for me, it always been presented as risks of categories. You know what I mean? If you're Black, you're more likely this. If you're Latino, that. But there are some things we're looking at data, you all, and this difference is happening because we've created it, whether it's by economics or gender or race. And when we really start unearthing that, I think it allows us to have this level of honesty about it and look at the systemic environmental things that's creating those differences. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Susanna, too, I just want to say I also appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that too, because that's so important too. That is this work. This is the equity in action piece, and a lot of the action piece is like recognizing our own feelings and reactions, emotions to this work, and then like working through them, like it's part of the process. So I appreciate that. Yeah, Nicole, I appreciate this data. It's striking. Every time I've seen data like this many times, but it's always striking. And you can put any health issue, almost any health issue, and you're going to get the same results, right? The people of color are more likely to experience some of these negative health outcomes. And yeah, and I think part of it's the language too. It's like, we want to keep saying people who are at risk, or is it the environments that are risky, or that communities are disproportionately, impacted, which is another way of saying it, but has a different meaning than that a person is at risk, right? It's like a different way of saying it. It's language I think about a lot, and the impact of that.
Yeah. I love everything you said, because what I think about specifically is because of how the data has been presented, we really do believe that some communities are just less healthy or more likely to, and that's not the case for everything. There are some few things that, are specific biologically, right? But a lot of our disparity data, we're looking at it in not the right way, and that's hard. It's hard to unlearn that. It really is hard to unlearn that. So thank you all for sharing so much. Carol, I saw you were you about to say something?
I feel like the day I started to write in the chat that, and the data is powerful. Like you can't look away from that. And a person like myself, I'm a white woman, I have privilege, and I have understood the amount of learning I need to do on my own. And and these type of data is a catalyst for myself and others who do my work to spend that time. So I appreciate the data. I also feel that, I forget who it was, Susanna, the more I hear it, the better. Hear this work and listen to you, Nicole, and it builds my muscle, right? Tools in my toolbox, because the way I've been informed and programmed is not this way.
I agree. Yeah. Look, I haven't been informed or programmed in this way either. I had to unprogram myself, you know? We are all in the same environment. We truly are. We truly, truly are. So thank you all for taking a moment to kind of really think on this and what it means for the communities we serve, you know? So the next word is inequity, and this word is really important because what you find is that disparities occur because of inequity.
I said, is it Nicole or is it us? And
She's
Lydia.
frozen on my screen.
Okay.
He's frozen on mine as well.
So
Yes.
Nicole, if you can hear us,
I'll
you have
text her.
frozen.
I'll text her.
Okay.
Hi. You are frozen. Delivered. Whoop. She may be joining again. So we'll admit her. She didn't reply, but I thought it was Needham. We're on the wireless. I didn't even put in my hard wire. So I don't see her.
No, I'm over at the schools, and I'm actually in a building that has decent Wi-Fi, so.
So here at the RRC, Susanna, when we come in and out, I'm on the wireless, and there are days it's better than others.
Appreciate your grace. I was freaking out. I was like, oh my God, what just happened? Okay. So what I like to make sure everyone heard before I got cut off, which is that truly your inequities are the root causes of disparities. And so whenever we see disparities, one of the first things I start doing now is to think about what are the access issues that's happening in that community, because that's the reason why this particular experience is happening. It's not about the race, it's not about the gender, because you could drop anybody into that environment and guess what? They would be impacted by that, okay? So that's what inequity is. Whenever we see disparities, the first thing we should be looking at is what are the inequity issues that are happening. The third term that's important are the social determinants of health. Now, this is a concept that is not new. I personally am a huge fan of it. A lot because I'm a sociologist as the background and training, but this is really thinking about the life-enhancing resources and how the distribution of those resources really impacts the longevity of your life, okay? So social determinants go in either direction. You can have determinants that actually boost your health, your quality of life, and you can have determinants that do the opposite. And so a part of what I share with folks is really thinking about, as you look at your community, there are 5 domains to consider in the social determinants, you really want to be thinking about how strong or weak are the determinants across these domains. And for me, this becomes our opportunity for collaboration. I love what Carol said yesterday, said a little bit earlier, right? It feels like yesterday because the Zoom cut off. But what Carol said at the beginning, which is look at the diversity of departments, of agencies, of organizations that are here right now, the collaboration that you all are doing. And so how do we make sure we're thinking about the determinants across these various domains through our collaborative partnerships, so that we can actually really help build an environment that supports the health and wellness of the communities we're serving? So I'm a huge fan of the social determinants. I think it's a really great way of thinking about health, wellness, and community health as a whole. The last term here is actually a collection of terms, and I added this to this presentation the last year or so, but it's looking at this concept of structural inequities, because I've always felt like this concept is a little bit hard to understand, and I heard it described really, really well, and it's this idea that structural inequities are a complex system with multiple parts, okay? And so I'm going to define these three parts and how they work together as a way of helping us think about that we do have the power and the ability to make change towards structural inequities. I think some of the biggest challenge when people step into wanting to do equity in action is it feels so big. It feels so daunting. Like, how do we change structural racism? How do we change sexism, right? Ageism, a lot of these things that really perpetuate the disparities. And so for me, I want to share these three terms and just thinking about what they mean. So the first is considering systems, all right? Our systems are how we organize life, okay? These are thinking about our ideals. We have all sorts of systems here in the US. We have an educational system, we have a healthcare system, we have law enforcement systems, okay? These are the kind of like big organizing frameworks that exist to give us some order in life and society, okay? So systems are extremely important. They are essentially built to do a particular function, okay, to do work, if you will. And if you think about the whole system, it is daunting to consider how do you change systemic stuff. However, systems are an important part of our process. They can be really rigid, unfortunately, sometimes. And so, you know, sometimes making systemic change can be challenging. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but it can be challenging. I always say, just look at where we are. For almost everyone in this room, just a couple generations back, the systems look extremely different. Even our healthcare system, our education system looked extremely different than what it looks like today. So systemic change is possible, right? It takes time. Sometimes it takes a generation, but it's possible. Somebody's got to begin the work somewhere. Okay. So I just like to mention it because I think sometimes people get overwhelmed by systemic stuff, thinking things can't change, but I'm like, things have changed a lot, even in the last century or so here in this country. The second term is considering what we call structures, okay? So if you have a system and the system is the whole, the structures, these are the doers, the agents within the system, okay? So for instance, inside of a healthcare system, you have all sorts of structures. You have hospitals, you have primary care, we have federally health qualified, health centers, even in all, you can pick any system, right? And you could think of all the structures, the doers within that system that carry out the will of the system, if you will, right? Most of us here are part of the healthcare system. Health departments are a structure within that system, okay? And we as the doers follow our agency rules, guidelines, all those sorts of things. A lot of our restrictions that we may experience as individuals in that system are there sometimes, right? Sometimes we have ideas for how we think things should change, but there are systemic things above that. So our structures are the doers that live inside the system. Again, things can change, right? You can create structural change that impacts the system. Okay, these are things that are doable. They're not always easy. So I think it's important to recognize that. And sometimes it takes time. And I think that's the hardest part. When we are often in the field of public health, compassionate folks who see things happening in the communities we serve, we want change now. We want it yesterday. However, when you work within a system and you're a part of a particular structure, that change isn't always very, very easy. Again, it doesn't mean it can't happen. I think about even some of our rules that have changed around tobacco smoking. You know, I mean, that's one of the biggest ones you can think about. Helmets, seatbelts in cars. Like there's a lot of examples that we forget sometimes where our society has truly changed because we made structural and systemic changes to how we live as a society. Which leads to the last word, right, which is society. And this is why all three of these words come together, okay? Society, systems, and structure. Society truly is us, okay? We, the people, essentially, right? And if you think about it, we as individuals, we're the ones who are the actual doers inside the structures that exist, that also exist inside of the system. So for me, the reason why I like thinking about this way is because if we begin to recognize that we are society, we are the people, we can begin and create structural and systemic change by us leaning in a place of advocacy, us leaning in a place of bravery and courage around putting equity into action, so that we can really begin to change how we think, our laws, our traditions, our beliefs, our values. To me, it is us who really create the change in the root, in the environment, so that the trees can prosper. Right? I think sometimes what can be a struggle is because we do think of things as outside of ourselves or this big governmental system that isn't made of people, it can be easy to feel like there isn't much I can do. Me as a person, me as an individual. And so my hope is that you all will feel encouraged that even if you work within a system that you feel is limited or a system that isn't progressive, that we all can use our voices towards developing change. And I think it's already beginning in the fact that we're having these types of conversations, you know? It's already beginning. We're already doing it, you know, because like I said, I know from the time that my grandmother was born in 29 to me, life has changed dramatically. A lot has changed in that time period. So change is possible. And I want people to feel encouraged that it is. I want to pause here just a minute to give us a moment to kind of process. I've talked about a lot of here in just this small bit of time, but just to think, are there any thoughts or reflections on these concepts, how this even plays into you as an individual in the system that you work in, and just if anyone had any thoughts they wanted to share on these concepts. Okay, good. All right. I always like to pause to make sure no one had any additional questions or thoughts. And of course, if they come to you, feel free to bring those up again. So we're moving into our last objective today, which is really more reflection here. So our last and final objective, this is where I'll really kind of get feedback from you all. So I'm going to go ahead and show the Mentimeter code here, the QR code. So all you have to do is grab your phone to bring up this code, because our last few questions here will generate on the slide together. So you can either do it this way on your phone. You can also pull up another browser and just go to menti.com. Type in that number, it'll drop you right into the presentation. Okay. I want to give everybody an opportunity to do this. Okay, great. Because our next couple of slides are really just we're moving into the discussion part of this to really kind of gain feedback from you all. So the first question is really just a feeling question, and I'm curious, a lot has been talked about. What are you thinking or feeling right now? And to begin to share those either in Menti, if you share it in Menti, it'll populate on the screen anonymously. I also welcome folks to use their voice to share this and to use the chat to share this. But I would be really curious, what are some things you're thinking and feeling right now? Oh, we got one person already got the Menti. Great. Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. We are the people. I love that too. Yeah. I'm very happy to see some positive feelings here, only because I will say, in doing this work for a long time, I remember a time and space where conversations around diversity, equity, disparity elicited non-positive stuff. Okay. Feeling of isolation, feeling of being judged, feeling of just like hopelessness, So I'm glad to hear, because I do this because I want to inspire, I want to empower. We really are the people, you all. We're the ones working the system. So if we are concerned about what the systemic issues are, we've got to have the courage to step up and to be a part of making those changes. Thank you for sharing about feeling overwhelmed by taking more committed action as society. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you for sharing that very honest thought process there. Because it's true. It is a big thing to take on, and that's a valid thing to kind of think about and consider. I know me, I am feeling very inspired. I realize this has been a really great time talking with you all. I've appreciated the comments you all have shared, you all being here, taking of your time to be here today so that we could talk about this and really begin to think about what is my role and how do I understand the role of data in discovering what's happening in my community, because I do believe this is foundational to everything else we'll be talking about over the next couple of weeks, So the second question I have for you all then, connected to this, is really to take a minute to think about, what do you believe you could do even after just today with what we've talked about? To really take a moment to think about what would be your place of action from here, because we've talked about a lot, and so I'll give you all some moments to kind of think here and type in your thoughts. And of course, if anybody wanted to use their voice, feel free to do that also. Mhm. Okay, great. And I believe, Carol, when you sent out, did we share the slide deck with folks? It's the handout, right? I can't
We
remember what we
gave
shared.
the book, the booklet,
Which
yes.
was-
Okay, okay. So I do have like the PDF version of the deck. I'm happy to share that with you all because I did see someone say wanting to share this with other folks. If you would find that a helpful tool for having conversations with people in your department, people above you, around you, below you, I'm happy to share this resource with you all, truly. Because I think the more we have people thinking differently about equity, the quicker we'll get to making some changes, you know? It was great. Hmm.
I just had a thought about this that I wanted to share while
Yes.
other people are still responding. When I was thinking about like sharing this with other people in my life, people in other fields, um, that's like a realization that I have a lot in the work that I do, where I've just kind of heard a lot of the same things over and over in school, and they kind of become common knowledge for me and my peers. And then when I realize that other folks don't know those things as easily, I'm surprised. Like I remember thinking the same thing with like contraception and other sexual health information when I used to study sexual health. But like when we're talking about how it's even like surprising for us to unlearn patterns of behavior and thought patterns, like, and this is the work that we do. Imagine how confusing or hard or unnatural it is for others. So I feel like it's important to acknowledge that other people don't know these things and maybe naturally wouldn't because of the way that our societies and systems are, and share that information with people that we're close with.
Yeah. What a valid point. Like truly, what a valid point. Because we're learning about this, or we have conversations about it because we are in public health. It comes up for us. And maybe not even holistically, but at least it comes up for us, right? And there's some spaces and industries, and you begin to see that, right? Where do we see it? Family and friends. That tells you very quickly, right? Is when you start having conversations at the dinner table or during holidays, and you hear some stuff, and it's like, oh man, that's just a little bit backwards of thinking, right? But the truth is, we are part of society, and I know I never learned any of this stuff, definitely not in high school, for sure, and I barely learned it in grad school, to be honest, you all. I had to seek out to learn the information, So I do think there's a lot of power in taking what we learn and sharing it out to other people, so that we can begin to change the way people are thinking about the work. So thank you for sharing that, Lydia. It's a valid point. So we've got about 15 minutes left together. I want to open up the floor for discussion, to give some breathing room for thoughts, for conversation, for folks to just share whatever they'd like to share. Or if you have any specific questions for me, I'm happy to take those questions too. And I'll give you guys a moment to think. The brain needs a little time to think when you're asked to ask a question. So we'll just pause here a minute. Yeah. Mhm.
So Nicole,
Yes.
I'm going to talk. I'm trying to make this simple. One of a goal I have, I'm on my board of health in my town. And I do this work. I have a challenge in getting people to stop and feel this is important to learn, this DEI principles, equity. I don't know if that's a function of just who I am, but you talked about us, you know, we are really the messengers in our community in prevention and public health and school health. In all your vast experience, you know, how do we build these bridges? Is it, you know, what do you found have been successful for people? Is it continuing to offer programs like yours at the most convenient time through Zoom? You know, I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. So where I found some success is when conversations or educational opportunities around this information is embedded into the work experience. So as cliche, right, as things like the required trainings for OSHA, bloodborne pathogens, ethics, right, some of the ones that we have to do, right? Most recently, my experience was a cybersecurity class I had to take. What's often missing is this information. I mean, I'm trying to think of all of us here. Were any of you required to take any sort of diversity, equity, inclusion that you felt was of great value as a part of your onboarding and employment experience? You know, I'm seeing some nods, maybe some a little bit yes, but it's not necessarily a standard practice. And then often what ends up happening is when it is offered, right? The people who volunteer are usually the people who are already somewhat there or already thinking about this, right? My question becomes, how do we reach the people who aren't here often, you know? So workspaces can be a place where we really embed conversations. I know that can be challenging too. It requires a systemic change because you usually have to go a little bit higher up to make sure, one, who's getting it, two, what is the quality of the training? Because the other thing that has happened too is as much as we want and find ease around self-directed learning and online learning, there's not a lot of people developing quality versions of that. I've done online cultural competency trainings that were like, I'm just clicking through to finish so I can get to the quiz. Do you know what I mean? That's like the reality. And some is because on the design side, we're not really investing in helping people actually learn in this space. This is the new fad, so let me make sure I offer it to my employees. Do you get what I mean? So that's one thing. The most recently, it was out in California where the California Department of Public Health, they kind of did a 4-month initiative where they had people apply or be a part of wanting to be an equity ambassador for the California Department of Public Health. This group of 100 people went through a 4-month training experience together so that they could then become ambassadors for equity throughout the various departments. And then they became like the champion, if you will, within their departments of making sure the information and the content they learn was taken and actually embedded. So there's a voice in the room that says, wait, have we thought about this? Or wait, this is disparity data that we're characterizing as people. Have we looked at the inequity issue? Because think about it, there's no one in the room to speak that. How can it be spoken? It becomes business as usual. So to me, to make the shifts that need to happen, you've got to get up to the systemic part because a lot of times it requires organizational support to make the kind of changes that need to be made so that the people who need to hear the knowledge hear it and get it and then implement it. So it's not easy, Carol.
I've got one more, you know,
Sure.
I'm on my board of health and in a town that is homogeneous, and people I know have good hearts, but they say, well, we don't really have much diversity here.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
you hear that, right? You know,
Oh, yeah, all the time. Yeah.
how do
So
you,
my response to that is the that just means people are limiting the conversation of diversity to skin color. Okay. And race is, or melanin in people's skin is an important context to consider. It is not the only context. So some of what happens there, and that is also because a lot of this conversation has become very racialized too, you know, and rightfully so, because when you start to look at the disparities, it gets even worse when you're a person of color. Unfortunately, though, because of how the topic has been framed, I think it's left people thinking the disparities are only an issue of race, that there's no other disparity issue. However, when you really tease it back, disparities happen along gender, along economics, along geography. And so what I usually talk to people about is you may not have racial diversity in your community, but you definitely have diversity. And you definitely have issues around inclusion that probably have to do with ability status or geography, technology divides, food desert divides, economic divides, all these other spaces that lend to having conversations around what is diversity, equity, inclusion, how does it look in my particular community. So that's usually the conversation I end up having, because there's still often systemic issues that are occurring in communities that are mostly homogenous, you know? So I hope that helps. I don't know if that makes sense for folks, but
thank
Could
you.
I,
yeah,
could
Allison.
I add to what Nicole is saying? I've been in lots of spaces like the ones you're talking about, Carol, that where folks say it's homogenous, right? And it may look like that among the folks who are at that table, right? It's not always the case for the whole community. There are always people of color, LGBT people, et cetera, in every community, right? Might not be represented. I think something that's been helpful has been helping folks make the connection, especially leadership, to their work to inequities, like finding shared values that everyone may have at the table can be helpful too. Like, why are we all here? Why are we doing this work? Often it will be similar or the same for the same reasons and the same values, and then connecting that to inequities. The other thing that's been helpful with some groups I worked with is the like designing from the margins. Has anyone heard of this term? And that's when we support a group that's the most marginalized in any community, then we are able to best support everyone. And it requires a lot of education around that, but there's a whole theory called designing from the margins around that. So for example, like a queer, trans person of color who's low income, right? That's like among the most marginalized person in a community because of all of these marginalized, oppressed identities. When we think about like how can we best serve this person and work with this person, this community, we're gonna by default we're gonna improve the services for everyone in the community. So I don't take up too much time, but just wanted to share that that's been helpful.
It's a great point. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
It's a great point. I love that. Any other thoughts folks wanted to share today?
I have one.
Yes.
So in our youth substance use prevention work, we rely heavily on data from our Metro West Adolescent Health Survey. It's a pretty rich trove of data that covers more than substance use, but we use that data to really help identify what the primary problems are, and we build logic models around that data and so on. Recently, in the fall, we received the newest survey data, the 2021 data, and the organization that helps administer and analyze the data brought us together for a meeting, and they shared disparity data. For example, they gave us interpretations of the substance use data as it intersected things like race, the LGBTQ community, mental health, students with disabilities. I know I'm probably missing a few, but those are just some examples. So they gave us this really helpful data, but now it's like, okay, well, that's wonderful that we know there are students out there who are more vulnerable to using substances based on these different attributes. And I'm challenged to figure out next steps for how do we reach those students, and how do we reach those students without like singling them out? I don't even know if there is even a way to identify them based on the survey, but like, how do we do that in a respectful fashion? So I bring that up just because I find that to be a very big challenge, but not one that I want to back away from, obviously.
That's great. That's awesome. And I love the fact that you're asking more questions. You know, like, here's the data. I'd be saying, what's the inequity issue that's creating that disparity too, you know? And it's like, this is how we critically analyze our information. It helps us plan better, right? And I think about what Allison just shared is designing for the margins, you know, and as we do that type of planning and implementation, how it truly, the ripple and domino effect of who else is positively impacted by those strategies. So I love what you're thinking, Karen. I'll just put this out here. I'd be happy to take a look at your data. If it helps to have a bit of a brainstorm around it, I'd be happy to take a look, and I'm sure Allison would too.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, yes, Monica.
Hi, just to bring it back to the very beginning when you had us write down in the 4 quadrants some of our thoughts and reflections. I just wanted to share with you that when you asked us to think about equity, like the very first question about, and what came to mind for me was the bicycle image. And I think for me, that has really been so helpful, because like how to be inclusive with people with so many different needs, you know, that is what it is. But it was, I have attended a talk by you before, and that stuck with me. So, you know, it's, and to Carol's point about like, how is it that you can talk to other different groups that are, or like lead a group that may not see it, you know, equity as an issue. It's such a simple image, but it's something that, you know, you don't even have to put words to it. You can just look at it like a billboard or something where you just kind of glance and think, wow, that's really powerful. Like it takes a minute and you don't even have to say a lot. It says so much without too much effort. And, you know, that's great. It's been updated. I'd be curious to see what the Robert Wood Johnson new image is. But this one for me works. So I just wanted to share that with you.
I'll bring it next week because someone shared it with me. So I'll bring it next week for sure. I'm glad you liked the image. That's great. Wow. Well, I really have appreciated everyone being here today. This has been awesome. I hope you'll be able to join us back next week. If you can, bring a friend, you know, the more the merrier. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some time with you all in good conversation. I'll pass it back to Carol to close us out for the day.
Yes, and I'll be brief and say Lydia will be emailing you all the session 2 workbook and the link again. And I agree. Please feel free to share the opportunity with anyone. I know Melissa is the health director in Walpole. She said, I put it on my coalition Facebook page. So Nicole is we're grateful to have her as our consultant with MassCALL3. We're grateful to Department of Public Health and BSAS, but Nicole's also been kind enough to say, yes, Carol, you can share it widely. So thank you for coming. And I don't know if you have anything to add, but we just look forward to next week. In the interim, you can email us if you have questions or.
Yeah, I think everyone will have my email address now too, if you want to reach out to me about it, but I'll send out the next week's stuff by Monday. And thank you, Nicole.
Yes. I hope to
Thank
see
you
you
all.
next week.
Happy Tuesday.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Karen.
We'll let you go. You guys are great. I know you probably got 5 more